What's poppin', you guys? How y'all doing this week? I hope y'all doing well. I hope y'all staying safe because the COVID is getting real and I don't even need y'all to be getting sick, so just stay home, stay safe. But anyway, if y'all new here, my name's Ciara and this is Self Made Energy, where we want for nothing because we can manifest anything. This week, you guys, I'm trying to be all in the Christmas spirit because Christmas is coming and we all just need to lift our spirits right now. This year has been like super trash. So let's just lift our spirits with a little Christmas activities. I'm gonna do a onesie because yes, I love onesies. And also, I ended up in a Secret Santa, so I'm gonna make my person a onesie. I love it. I already did it, so I love it. It's so cute. I can't wait for y'all to see it. And I'm also going to decorate my door. And I think I'm going to build a gingerbread house. So let's get into these activities because I'm ready. Oh, wait. Before we even get into it, I got to tell y'all about my little details. Do y'all see? Do y'all see these details? Like, look, look. Yes, get into it. Let's get into the festivities. Okay, you guys, so the first thing I'm gonna do to get into my holiday activities is wrap my door. And this is so easy, you guys. Like, literally, all you need is a roll of wrapping paper from the store and some tape or some anything to adhere it to your door temporarily. So, this is my wrapping paper. It says Merry and Bright, and it also has lines on the back just for easy cutting. And literally, it's so easy, you guys. Now, because my wrapping paper's design was sideways and not straight down the roll, I did have to do some cutting, but that wasn't hard either. I just measured out the width of the door and cut 3 equal pieces. And I tried to line up the design as much as I could, but it didn't really line up. But that's fine, you don't really notice in the end. Of course, unless you're staring, but don't be staring because it's still cute. But anyway, all you want to do is put the roll of paper against your door and mark out where you need to cut any places out, like for the door hole, for the knob, for the keyhole, for the places on the side of the door where it sticks out. Anything that's going to poke through the paper, you need to cut around it with some sort of X-Acto knife or some scissors. Anything sharp really, but an X-Acto knife would be perfect for the job. Once I was done cutting out all the pieces that I needed to cut out, I just adhered the paper to the door with some double-sided tape. I just put the tape down on the door, and then I removed the paper that covers the adhesive, and I put the paper on top. And that was it. Decoration was done. Here's my rug. I love it. It's so adorable. Just to dress up the floor a little bit. And I'm also going to use these leaves and bells just to give it a little glitter and make a little jingle, because why not? And my door is done. But of course, you're going to have to wait for the reveal. So let's get into this onesie. The first thing I did for this onesie was find a onesie that I already had just to measure things out. But you can also use a hoodie or some sweatpants that you love how they fit and use those to line up this pattern as well. I just cut out the back of the pattern by laying it down and make sure I cut out around the arm sleeves and around the hood, because those are separate pieces, so you don't want to cut it out as one. Once I was done cutting out the back pattern, I flipped the onesie over and I just rolled it down and did the same exact thing. So I made sure to move the sleeves out of the way, I made sure to move the hood out the way, make sure everything is nice and flat so your patterns will match up nice and even. And also, don't forget to mark your patterns front and back, because they do look similar, but they are cut different. I also used an inch of seam allowance just because I wanted it to have a really baggy fit. And since it wasn't for me, I did want to make it a little bit bigger just so I had a little wiggle room for the fit. I also forgot to mention I cut both of those patterns out on double layers, but not on the fold, because that pattern just happened to have a seam going up both ends on the front and back. But the sleeve I did cut out on the fold because there was not a seam on the top of the sleeve. There was only a seam on the bottom. So if you want yours to look like mine's, cut your sleeves out on the fold. And make sure you do cut out a left and a right sleeve because the pattern is different. So you want it to match up with the difference on the pattern that you cut on your body pieces previously. And don't forget to mark your left and right sleeve because they do look very similar. Once I was done with the sleeves, I moved on to the hood. The hood that I'm following just happens to have 3 separate pieces. So the piece that I just cut out, I don't actually need 2 layers, I only needed 1. I folded it in half and I cut it down the middle because there's a seam down the middle back of the hood. Now the piece that goes around the front of the head, it has no seams in it. It is one piece. So in order to achieve this look, I cut it out on the fold at the top of the head. So there's 2 layers of fabric and the fold is at the top where my horn is located. And then the bottom is just open. And I just followed the pattern. I did not follow the curve just because I wanted to give it a little more room for hair because girls do have hair. So I also folded it down and followed that neckline and just cut it straight across. So this piece is one piece. Once I was done cutting out all the pieces that I needed, it was time to pull Trixie out and do a couple test strips because I did have to change the tension on my machine since I'm working with this fleece. Once I was happy with how the stitches came out, I took the 2 back pieces and pinned them right sides together up the whole back seam from the crotch all the way up to the neck. And I did a zigzag stitch all the way up those pins. And while you're pinning and sewing, you want to make sure that you do not pull this fabric. Although the fabric does have some stretch, that's why I did a zigzag stitch. It does not have much stretch and it's pretty structured. So you don't want there to be any buckles in your seams because of you pulling and tugging at the fabric while you're sewing it. Once I was done sewing the back pieces together, I moved on to the front pieces. And to do the front pieces, I did a little trick that I learned from with Wendy. Her channel is so amazing. So if you want to learn sewing tips, go check that out. But anyway, I had to put an invisible zipper and I suck at installing zippers. So what I did was did my regular tight stitch from the bottom of the zipper to the bottom of the crotch. And then where the bottom of the zipper to the neckline was, I did a very loose basting stitch that I was going to remove later. That just helped me keep the fabric together to create that middle seam for where the zipper was going to be. And you guys, this was so helpful. Like, oh my god, it was so helpful. But anyway, because I was changing the tension of my machine again, I did want to do a test strip. Just because this was a gift, I did want to make sure it looked nice and professional. I wanted it to look store-bought and not cheaply made. So I did do a test strip. From the top of that seam where I did at the crotch, I did a loose basting stitch starting there all the way up to the neckline. And I did not do a back stitch at the beginning or end of the seam because that will make it harder to take out later. So for this part, don't back stitch. Once I was done with that part, I laid it flat and I opened up that seam so I could prepare it for the zipper. You do want to make sure that this part is nice and flat and everything is nice and even, because when you apply the zipper, any lumps or bumps will show. And I am a testament to that because I did have to do some seam ripping and some double stitching. So make sure everything is nice and flat in this part. In order to install the zipper, I faced it right side down onto the fabric and I made sure the middle of those teeth lined up with the middle of that seam. And I pinned everything into place. Make sure when you're pinning the zipper into place, the top of the zipper lines up with the top of that fabric, because you are going to have to sew it down, and in order to create a hem, you're going to have to fold it down. So you do want to leave that space when you pin it in. I did not leave that space, but thankfully I figured out what to do. I decided to be brave today and use a zipper foot. This is my first time using a zipper foot, and it wasn't too complicated. I did have to try like 3 or 4 times, so I did do some seam ripping like I told you before, but that's fine. Once everything was nice and lined up, it came out so perfectly. In order to install the zipper, I just lined up the side of the teeth with the side of the zipper foot as close as I could get it, and I did a straight stitch down the entire length of the zipper. Also, keep in mind that when you're installing the zipper, you're also securing that seam into place as well, because once you remove that middle stitch, that seam will not be secured if you don't stitch it with the zipper as well. So make sure you're catching both layers when you're installing the zipper. I did miss some spots, and I ended up going in with E6000 glue just to hold that seam into place, and everything still looked nice and seamless. But just a forewarning for you, so you don't have to do a bunch of seam ripping and restitching. Make sure you catch both layers of fabric, the zipper and the fabric that you folded down from that seam, when you're stitching it closed. Front and back right sides together, and I lined them up at that middle crotch seam. This is a seam that you want to make sure is very even. So when you're pinning everything into place, make sure you start from that middle seam and sew outwards, just to make sure everything lines up in the middle, and the bottoms you can trim even later. And y'all, do y'all see that seam? Woo! It's almost perfect. But anyway, back to work. I pinned both shoulder seams together, right sides together, starting at the sleeve, and I also pinned down the entire length of the side seams on both sides. And then you're just going to sew along those pins up the entire length of this giant loose body bag, and it's going to take forever, but it's so rewarding and it's so amazing, and you're going to love it, so just do it. When I pinned the front and back pieces together, I made sure to line them up at that bottom of where the sleeve would be installed. You want the sleeve part to be lined up because that shape is going to equal in with the shape of the sleeve that you cut out earlier. So you want that part to be nice and even. Again, you can always trim the leg part later to make it even, but you can't really even up the sleeve unless you cut it and remeasure it and do everything again. And we don't want to do that, so make sure your sleeve parts are lined up. Also, don't forget when you're sewing this fabric not to pull or push or tug at the fabric. Just let it glide through the machine, let the machine do the feeding for you, because this fabric is not very forgiving at the seams. If you do some lumpy seams, you're gonna have some lumpy seams. That's it. Once you have the side seam sewn in, the piece really starts to come together, because now you can really see what it's gonna look like. And y'all, this piece is so cute. Like, look at the fabric. Look at these cute little snowflakes. Like, It's like girly but not too girly, because I know everyone's not such a girly girl like me, but I still wanted it to be a little feminine, not so manly, because it is for a girl. But anyway, not giving any spoiler alerts, it is for a girl, so I didn't want it to be a little girly but not too girly. But yes, anyway, back to what we were doing. Once I sewed in the side seams, I moved on to sewing the shoulder seams together. And I did end up cutting like that back neckline a little bit because it was too big. It just didn't line up with the hood, and it didn't line up with that front shoulder seam either. So starting from the outside of that shoulder seam where the sleeve would be, I sewed the zigzag stitch straight into the neckline, and then where I had the excess of fabric, I just ended the stitch there and did a back stitch, and I cut off the excess fabric once I was done. Once I was done sewing in those shoulder seams, I was pretty much done with the body of the onesie, so I moved on to doing the sleeves. In order to make the sleeves, I just pinned up that one seam, and I sewed a zigzag stitch straight across the pins along the entire length of the sleeve. I did that for both sleeves, and the sleeves were done. When sewing the sleeves together, you want to make sure the fabric is right side together, and you want to make sure that you do a back stitch at the beginning and end of those stitches, because these stitches you do want to keep. Once you're done, you're going to flip it right side out so the sleeve looks nice and regular, and you're going to move on to doing the exact same thing to the other sleeve. So you're going to face the fabric right sides together, sew a zigzag stitch straight down the entire length of the sleeve, and then you're going to flip it right side out so it looks like a regular sleeve, and then your sleeves are done for real. Once I was done making the sleeves, I took the onesie, made sure it was inside out, and I took the sleeves and put them in the respective holes, right sides touching. So I made sure the sleeves were right side out, and I stuck it inside the onesie that was inside out. Left sleeve with left sleeve and right sleeve with right sleeve, and I lined them up at that inner seam. Now, because I had the extra seam allowance around the sleeve, I did have some gathering at the top of the shoulder where the sleeve was installed, and I actually think it's pretty cute, so I'm not mad at the gathering. So if you do have this issue with gathering, you want to make sure that the gathering is at the top of the shoulder and not under the arm. It should be completely flat under the arm, just for comfortability reasons. Once my sleeves were pinned into place to my liking, I did a zigzag stitch around the entire opening of that sleeve hole, and I did the same exact thing for the other one. And I made sure where it was gathering, I did push a little just so the gathers would be nice and even, but other than that, I didn't cause any stress to this material. I also made sure to start sewing at the seam so that they would be lined up perfectly once I was done. I wanted to make sure all the seams were lined up so it looked very professional and crisp and clean once everything was done. And it did, so I'm very pleased. Once I was done installing the sleeves, I moved on to making the hoodie. And once I made the hood part, it was basically done. The only thing I did after that was install elastic around the ankle part and around the wrist part. And sadly, that part was not recorded, so I'll just tell you about it now. I installed elastic around the wrist and the ankle part. Now, to make the hood, I took those two back pieces that I had cut in half earlier, and I placed them right sides together, and I sewed a zigzag stitch up the straight part of those pieces. Not the curved edge, the straight edge. Once I was done making that piece, I took the other piece, that long piece, and I made sure I lined up the middle of that piece with that middle seam. So I just folded it in half, and right where that half was, I pinned it to that middle seam, right sides together, and then I pinned down both sides, right sides together, around the entire curve. And again, just to make sure the seams was nice and even, I started from the middle. That's just very helpful to do when you're making new seams. And as you can see, I was completely sewing a ghost stitch because my bobbin thread ran out. That is definitely a problem I have with the side loading machine, but it's completely fine. Just sew your ghost stitch, rethread the bobbin, and move on with life. Once my bobbin was fully locked and loaded, I went back to sewing the entire perimeter of the hood. And again, I started from that middle seam and sewed down the left, and then I went back to the middle and sewed down the right. Now the hood is completely done, and you can pin it to the outside of that body piece, right sides together, starting with that middle seam. Make sure that middle seam lines up, and there is going to be a seam on the side of the neckline that is also going to line up with the shoulder seam. So make sure those seams line up as well. And then the hoodie will come full around to the neck, and it will meet the zipper. So you make sure that part lines up as well. Now you should have had enough room for all of these things to line up when you cut out the pattern, so you shouldn't be worried at this part. But if not, just try your best, and if it doesn't line up, it is what it is. It's still going to be cute, and it's the hood, so nobody's going to see that neck seam anyway. The hood hangs down regardless. Once I was done pinning everything into place and I was sure that my seams were all lined up the way that I wanted them to be, at least as best I could, I sewed a zigzag stitch around the entire neckline. And that was pretty much it. Again, make sure not to pull and push and tug at the fabric, because there are a lot of seams. It does create a little bit of bulk at this part, so your machine is going to want to struggle a little bit. So just go slow and take your time, and everything will be just fine. Once I was done installing the hood to the actual onesie, I just did a rolled hem on the front of the hood, the part that's actually going to be over your face, just to clean up all the hems and have no fraying later. Even though this fabric doesn't have any fraying, I just wanted to make sure. So I just folded the hem down, did a straight stitch, and then I folded it down again and did another straight stitch, and the hoodie was secured and locked into place, and it wasn't going to fray anytime soon. So here I am, just evening out that bottom hem, just because it was a little uneven after making sure everything else was even in the beginning. So I just evened it out, and I installed that thicker elastic. I believe it was 1 inch elastic, just on both legs. I folded it up and made a thick enough channel for the elastic to fit through, but I didn't sew the actual elastic to the fabric. I just made a channel for the elastic to fit through, sewed a straight stitch, I sewed a zigzag stitch around the entire perimeter of the ankle part, and I did that to both ankles, and then I inserted the elastic in and I closed that piece up. Oh yeah, I probably should have mentioned to leave an opening that's about 2 inches wide so you can fit the elastic through, so you can get it through the channel. So sew around the entire perimeter, leaving a 2-inch opening on both ankles so you have room to put the elastic in. Once the elastic is in, then you close it up with another zigzag stitch, top stitch around the entire ankle, and then your ankles will be done. Do the exact same thing to the wrist part. So I used a 3/8 inch elastic for the wrist, just because the wrists are a little more dainty than the ankles. I wanted it to be smaller. I did also sew a straight stitch across both layers of elastic once it was inside the channel, just to complete the loop.